This week we are looking at the lesson plan template, which last week was introduced, biblical backgrounds, and learning domains. All of these things come together when you're making your lesson plan. We went through each and every component of the lesson plan template last week. So this week we're going to focus on the learning domains and biblical backgrounds, which are part of your preliminary work prior to you actually constructing your lesson plan. You will need to do a biblical background paper, and there's instructions for that in your syllabus. It's quite important that when a teacher is preparing to a lesson, whether that's for Sunday morning or a Bible study at any other time, that they are able to review some information that will give them an understanding of the passage. Every teacher is not going to have access to commentaries and other biblical resources that's going to help them. And so it's real important that we're able, as writers of lessons, it's real important that we give them that information, succinct as it may be. Typically, it's only a couple of paragraphs. If you've ever used a curriculum book that's been published by Lifeway or any other curriculum publisher, you'll see that prior to the actual lesson of what's going to happen there, that they give a really brief introduction to that lesson on that scripture passage. So you are going to need to write a paper, but then including in your lesson plan, you're going to need to include some biblical background as well. That's all explained, should be explained hopefully clearly in your syllabus. Now, the learning domains that we're going to be focusing on for this course are the cognitive domain and the behavioral domain. Behavioral is sometimes called the psychomotor domain. One of the reasons that we use the term behavioral instead of just psychomotor in the education realm is psychomotor is actually your brain telling your body to do something. So in a great sense, it's also learning to walk. That's a psychomotor exercise, or learning to use your fingers to hold a fork. And so when someone is in physical therapy, they are learning to psychomotor skills. And so what we're hoping for through the educational process is not just merely psychomotor skill, but behavioral change. So we're hoping to produce at the end of a lesson a change in behavior, not just a physical skill. Now, sometimes we're actually teaching a physical skill. Most often in theological education and Bible study, it's behavioral, but sometimes it could be a psychomotor skill. A behavioral kind of skill would be a little different from that. You have two lessons to produce in this course. One has a cognitive focus and one has a behavioral focus. So in the learning domains that we're going to be focusing on primarily then are the cognitive domain and behavioral. There is the affective domain as well, and you will be introduced to that domain, but it is not a part of your lesson plans in the goal sense, the learning outcome. Now, clearly, because students have to demonstrate an understanding, or they will be demonstrating a skill, or they'll be demonstrating something else, then anytime we demonstrate something and it's observable, in some sense, it is behavioral. So I know it can be a bit confusing, somewhat like the Trinity. That's confusing as well, but believe me when I say you will get a better grasp on learning goals as we're going to look at those next week. But the learning domains, the cognitive domain begins with the level of knowledge, and knowledge is just data. It is information, it is facts, it is things that we can memorize. Even though it's complicated information, you can memorize an outline of a book of the Bible, you can memorize dates, you can memorize scripture passages. All of that is information. That is the lowest form of learning. It is knowledge. All of the other steps on that ladder that you'll see in your PowerPoints and in your textbook, all of those other steps fall under the umbrella of understanding. So a student for your learning goals would either be demonstrating knowledge, which is the basic one, or they will be demonstrating understanding, which would include, that covers all the other steps. And in that cognitive domain, we're moving from the ability to just repeat facts, which is the basic knowledge, all the way to the top, which is evaluating. And so when you are able to look at a passage of scripture, look at any other kinds of documents that you, if you're in church leadership and administration, you're looking at manuals and evaluating them. That's the highest level. So you move from being able to know what component parts go in this all the way to the top to say, okay, this is, I'm able to evaluate. I'm able to evaluate another person's work. I'm able to evaluate my own work. And so that's the top level. You have to know where your students are in order to teach them well. If students do not have basic knowledge, they're certainly not going to be able to do an evaluation. So knowledge comes first, and then you move up the ladder. In behavioral, you are teaching them to actually perform something, to perform a task, to be able to, they're going to demonstrate an ability to do something. And so you're going to be able to see those steps as well in your PowerPoint. Those are listed there for you. The primary one that we tend to focus on the most in Bible study is cognitive. We focus on that a great deal. But there's a really a great opportunity for us to also focus on behavioral. Now, can you have behavioral change without some understanding? No. You really have to have both. When we teach, even for behavior change, they are learning something cognitively. When you learn something cognitively, that typically leads to a behavioral change. They're very much related. Now, what about that affective one? If students are not engaged in what you're doing, if you're not doing anything in the course of your lesson to hook them in emotionally, then they're not going to pay attention. They're not going to get it cognitively, and there will be no behavioral outcome. For instance, you'll know if your students are with you if they are paying attention, if they're listening, if they're leaning forward, if they're asking questions. All of those things are indicators that students are effectively engaged. When they close their eyes, when they lean back in their chair, when they nod off, when they do these things, they are not effectively engaged. We know when students are taking notes and when they're looking at you and making eye contact. That is an affective response. Now, it's extremely difficult to assign a grade to an affective response. So in a course, an academic course, when we have affective responses, it is extremely challenging to put a grade on it. For instance, if a goal is that you will appreciate let's say for even teaching the Bible, that you are going to value, that you will appreciate the role of Bible study in Christian formation. Well, how am I going to grade that? How do I know how you really feel? So if I ask you if you appreciate it in some way, of course you would say you do, because you want to get a good grade. So if we're assigning grades to appreciation and to value, then we get a false read sometimes. If I ask students to write a reflection paper about something so that I can see how they feel about it, what their experience was like, well, if they had a bad experience, but they write the paper and they're truthful about that, then they would have to be scored appropriately. Yes, they did write their paper. They were honest about their experience. Maybe my goal was for them to have a positive experience, but that didn't happen. So you can see how complicated it is to actually assign a grade to something that's affective. Well, we don't really grade Bible study. In this course, teaching the Bible is not about helping to prepare you to teach an academic course, but to teach Bible study. But the same principle holds. How are you going to assess it? How will you really know if they appreciate and value something? So for those reasons, we want you to include things in your session that will draw students in, that will show us that they're engaged, that will show you that they're engaged, that will draw them affectively, but it's not to be the learning outcome for your session. We're going to stick with cognitive and behavioral outcomes. And we're going to go through those even in more detail for you so that you'll understand exactly how to write those. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to call.